John Harland of Palomar College has a PhD in mathematics and a passion for physics. He's been developing a theory that relates classical and quantum foundations. It's extra dynamical and evolutionary. And he thinks, I think, it may have something to do with active inference, which is a profound framework originating in neuroscience related to artificial intelligence, robotics, consciousness studies, biology, sociology, and has universal application. And so we're going to have John present his ideas to Daniel Friedman, president of the Active Inference Institute, a bringing together of the great minds. And I am Andrius Kulikauskas. This is Math for Wisdom. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm going to start us off with 10 or 15 minutes about Kalman filters, which is something I learned, which I think will help to provide a setting for what John is doing. So this is from control theory. I'll relate it to a language of wisdom that I've worked on all my life, wondrous wisdom, including the three minds and the learning cycle, the three cycle. And then I will also talk about how those relate to active inference, just as a way of setting this up. Then John will present his ideas for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll hear from Daniel for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have discussion, hopefully for at least 15 minutes. So why don't I just begin, and I'll share my screen. What I'd like to talk about is, let's see here. Okay, and you see my screen, I think, and you see this handsome gentleman, Michel van Bliezen, I think. Do you? It says
Yes,
Kalman filter?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Kalman filter in control theory, it's an example of a classic pattern that I call the three minds, which are three levels of awareness. And I would think of them as an answering mind, like from the unconscious. We get all these answers, what we think we know. We don't know why, but they're coming at us. And there's furthermore a questioning mind, like that's prattling in us, that's asking, maybe evoking these answers. So it's kind of like a second layer of awareness. And then there's a third mind, the investigating mind, that tries to set up and relate those two. So there's many ways to think about it. One is that you want to have the same information in two forms, in terms of what's known, but also in terms of what's not known. And if you can put it in those two different forms, you get like a full-fledged logic, and it's very robust. And that qualitatively, they can be quite different. So you can imagine having a brain with 100 billion neurons just passively filtering information in terms of what we know. But you could also have like a predictive mind that's trying to predict what's out there and imagine all kinds of concepts that maybe they're not real, but they're useful. And so maybe you have 10,000 100,000 cortical columns, or maybe 100,000 concepts that have a network of language that are black boxes that kind of don't make sense, but they make sense through their relations. And so you have these two different, maybe divorced realities, but you try to match them up. And that's what the third mind's about. You investigate, you match them up, and then you see which one you'd like to apply in reality. Your intuitive, lucky mind, let's say, or your rational, careful mind. So that may sound peculiar, but let's look at how that functions in the Kalman filter. Okay, so the Kalman filter is a process where you don't have perfect information. Let's say you have a spaceship that you're trying to navigate, and you don't exactly know where it is, but you'd like to know where it is as well as possible. And you're going to use two kinds of information. One is going to be measurements. You could think of this as sensory evidence provided by your instruments. And the other information is going to be laws of physics, some kind of regularities that tell you, let's say, how objects move. Let's say that there's principles of gravity. Or simply that if something has a velocity, it's going to move with that velocity. So you can kind of predict that way. And now let's imagine that you have information from both sources and that they come with errors. Okay, all this is imperfect. And then the whole trick is, well, how do you integrate this information and how do you decide which information to lean more in favor of? How do you decide to look at those errors and figure out what things are actually more to be weighed or not? So the weighing factor is called the Kalman gain, and that's written here, kg. And so it's basically saying, when you have these errors of two kinds. Now, the error from the measurement, which is, let's say, GPS or whatever it could be, telling you, let's say, your location, maybe your speed. But that error is going to be typically fixed. It's not changing. So according to this model, you'll assume. But the error of your estimate may be improving. So in the beginning, you may really have no idea where you are. And so you'll rely more on your error from the measurement, so the GPS is maybe good within, 100 feet or whatever. But your guess may be off by 1,000 miles, let's say. So when this estimate is very large, let's say it's 1,000 miles, and this is 1,000 miles, and this is just 100 feet, then this will be practically equal to 100%. It'll be 1. Whereas let's say that you actually can pinpoint where you are using your laws of physics and using your prowess over statistical error management, and you can say, hey, I can get it down to an inch. So if it's 1 inch over 1 inch plus 100 feet, let's say, well, then 1 inch over 100 feet is basically 0. So you can kind of see the common gain is going to be between 1 and 0, depending on those two situations. And if they're equal value. So let's say that you manage to get the error from both sources, that they're both equal. Well, then the common gain will be 1/2. It's basically picking the position right in half. So the first step is you get your common gain, which is your steering. It's the cybernetic part. It's the third mind that's relating the other two minds. And then you say, okay, now I'm going to change the estimate of my, let's say, location, to keep this simple, or it could be something like temperature, but let's use location. And you say, okay, here's the temperature at time t. It's going to be the temperature at time t minus 1 plus an adjustment, which is the difference between the most recent measurement I have minus where I thought I was, times the common gain, let's say. So you take the measurement, you subtract this. Now, let's say they're identical. Let's say the measurement is exactly where you're supposed to be. Well, then this will be 0, and then you just use the point where you were. That's where you are. Now, if they're quite different, let's say they're quite different, then it's going to depend on the common gain, which is factoring the estimate. So if they're different, and you think that the measurement is good, right? Like, so that's a small error as opposed to this. Well, then the common gain will be 1. And so then you want to use, if you think the measurement's really great, then you want to have the common gain will be 1. And then actually you add this all together, it'll be this minus that. You'll just be left with a measurement, just because it's good. If the measurement is bad and this is huge, well, then this common gain will be 0, and then you're just going to ignore the whole thing. Okay, and so then if it's somewhere in between, well, then you'll combine it. But we won't worry about that. But just not to spend too much long on this, but you just say, okay, and then you're going to adjust the estimate. The estimate will be you multiply this times this over this plus this. So if they're all roughly equal, then this will be squared. These will be 2 times this. It'll basically be the error divided by error squared divided by 2 times error, that'll be the error divided by 2. So you're reducing the error by 2. And otherwise, I won't go through the math, but you can imagine if I think if the error in maybe this is not important. We'll just skip this. But basically, you're going back between the error and the one and the other. The crucial thing is that in terms of the three minds, the error in the instrument is the first mind. It's telling you what you know. The laws of physics and stuff, it's kind of like this second mind that you're using that's kind of based on what you don't know, these black boxes. But the third mind is this Kalman gain that's fitting it together. And so then maybe one more thing just to show in terms of that. I want to go back then. I've explained the three minds. I've explained the Kalman filter a little bit. And then in terms of the free energy principle, what Daniel will talk about, I just want to give a very quick run through of the free energy principle, where it's coming from. It's coming from two things, and this is where the three minds are coming. So it's going to be this line basically right here. And you have states and you have evidence. So let's say X is a state and Y is an evidence. So like Y would be the first mind is giving you evidence, and X is a state in your mental little model. And so one of the things that you're using is the fact about probabilities, that if I want the probability of both of these happening or being true, then it's the probability of the one, let's say it's the probability of the evidence, and then it's the probability given the evidence, what's the state. So you have that combination. That's classic probability. And then P is actually going to be the information with regard to the sensory world. So maybe it's that 100 billion neurons. But Q will be a model of that. And it may be much simpler. It may be 100,000 concepts or cortical columns. But this is modeling that. And so this is the two things we're relating. And so this is like the two minds. And so in what John will talk about, he'll talk about how you have a total knowledge of a system, which will be this P, but how you may have a niche or a subsystem. And that's the theme of today, is basically, what is it like to develop a niche, to model a niche, to have an organism and a niche, let's say, or multiple organisms and a niche? How does that co-evolve? What's the significance of that? And so then what we do is we compare these two. We say, okay, Q of X is Q of X, that's the internal model. But then you have this breakdown in the sensory world. And note that in the inner model, you're ignoring the evidence. The evidence is something maybe just too specific, but you're trying to focus on the more general thing. You'll take the logs of that, okay? And then you multiply by Q of X across all that, because that's going to be your inner lens. And then you sum over all the possible states, and so you get an expected value. And so that's basically going to be the free energy principle. It's going to have these two terms. And then this one will be called the divergence. This will be called the surprise, basically, if you work it out. This log of 1 over pi is just based on the probability, the sensory world. This part will be based on comparing your inner model with the sensory world, given the evidence, what's the state? So that's just a run through. We can come back to this, I don't know. But the point being there, in the active inference world, the three minds are coming in several ways. You're comparing evidences from the sensory world with states in the mental world. You're comparing probability distribution P, which is modeling like total knowledge, total sensory knowledge of the world, with a probability distribution Q, which is trying to forget a lot of that and just focus on the essence of certain concepts that would be helpful. And then this is for the free energy principle, but above and beyond that, active inference talks also about perception action loops. And the cool thing about perception action loops from the point of view of this predictive or Bayesian or forward-looking process is that when you have a perception action loop, you can respond to what you're learning from the environment. You can respond in two ways. When your model doesn't match up with the sensory evidence, you can update your model, but you could also update the world. So you have this freedom to do which is which. The free energy principle tells you basically which is cheaper. The beauty of active inference, I think, is that powerful idea. I think that's why it attracts wonderful people who love this kind of way that freedom enters into physics and biology and possibly. So that's introductory idea. The last thing to say is that you'll have like a 3 cycle in this Kalman filter. Like you take a stand, follow through, reflect. You can kind of see this iterative process and how it relates to the 3 minds. That's another thing to keep in mind. So now I hand it over to you, John, please.
Oh, much of the work I've done in the last 10 years or so in physics has to do with an idea that really came from evolution. But I think, you know, maybe a more circumscribed context would be just thinking about linear dynamical systems and whether you can have a subsystem that sort of stands on its own. You know, what does that mean for a subsystem to stand on its own? So so a linear dynamical system it's a set of, you can think of it as a set of configuration vectors. It starts with the initial configuration, then x1, then x2. So these are successive configurations. These could be configurations. These could be states of a computer memory, or they could be population vectors in ecology, where the way to get from one state to the next state is by means of just multiplying by a matrix A. So these are all, say, in some certain dimensional space, and or it could be in complex space in the case of physics, in the case of quantum mechanics. And let me know if you can hear me. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, great. And how do you get from one state to the other? You get, you know, like x1 is equal to some matrix A. A is a m by m matrix. And you just simply multiply this matrix repeatedly. And then you can work that out, that on the nth state, the way you get from the 0th state to the nth state is just simply multiplying by the nth power of this matrix. So the matrix is what defines the linear dynamical system. And my question, you know, in terms of thinking about biology, I was thinking, okay, if you have a biological system that's modeled this way, we know that in biology there's breakdowns into niches. You know, you think of a niche for an ant, or a niche for a human, or a niche for say a kelp plant. And yes, the overall biological system is acting on every single organism, but it would be impossible to have niches and to have evolution unless there was some breakdown of that dynamical system, some cogent breakdown where you could identify some subsystem that sort of acts in somewhat of an independent fashion. In other words, this matrix has to somehow break down, if we're talking about just a single niche, has to somehow break down into a subsystem B. And you know, you can always do this with a matrix. You always choose a subspace, and I'm going to choose a subspace for a subsystem. Let's call this, let's see, our subspaces, let's call K our subspace. So this is the subsystem. And then just any other, the complement of that, we'll just call L. And then there's going to be some breakdown. We're thinking of this as a subspace. So, and what is the ideal breakdown? And this would be an isolated niche if you had this ideal breakdown. Would be that A3 is equal to 0. And I'll show you how that works. So that A is equal to A1, A2, 0, B. Now, why is that an ideal subsystem? Because when you take like A squared, you get, just multiplying these matrices out, you get A1 squared, and then you get A1, A2, I'm sorry. On the next one, you get A1, A2 plus B. Let's see, I got to think. Sorry, I'm going to write this out next door to this so I don't make a mistake. So I want to multiply those two together. So I get A1 squared in the upper left block, and then I get A1, A2, yeah, A1 on the left, and then A2 on the left, A plus A2B. And then I get 0 here, and I get B squared. I have to wait for my pen to recover. Sorry, I'm having problems with my stylus here. Okay, so, and then if I go up to the nth power, I get A to the nth is equal to A1 to the nth. And then I get some stuff here. It's non-zero, then I get 0, and then B to the nth. And what that means is that this overall dynamics, if I just restrict this overall dynamics to the subsystem, this just looks like the submatrix to the nth power. So essentially, if I restrict my attention to this subsystem, I don't have to think about the larger environment. I can think about just the subsystem dynamics, and that dictates the dynamics of the subsystem, and therefore the larger dynamics is not at play at all. Now, there is feedback from the subsystem to the larger system, and you can see that up here. In other words, in terms of these systems, there is no crosstalk from the larger system down to the subsystem, but there is crosstalk from this subsystem back up to the larger system. So this stuff here is dependent on A1, A2, and B, whatever the junk is up there. But the operative principle is that this acts independently. This is like a perfect niche where you can just focus your attention on the variables related to the subsystem, and you don't have to worry about the larger world. The larger world does not feed back into the subsystem. And that was a perfect, again, a perfect situation where there's no loss of information by just focusing on the subsystem. Now, the question is, is there a breakdown into this subsystem? This subsystem is acting. In other words, there's some sort of an invariant subspace here that can act independently. And does the overall dynamics break down into some kind of an invariant subspace? And I think the answer generally is no, that you don't get perfect niches. But let's suppose that you do have a perfect niche. The question is, how would you evolve this? How would you determine this subspace if it actually did exist? And so, and my answer is that I don't know. But in terms of a Kalman filter, I've always dreamed that there could be an evolutionary algorithm that somehow, adjusts the subspace and moves more and more toward independence of this subsystem as you kind of adjust the angle of the subspace, as you adjust the parameters that you're looking at, the particular niche variables that you're looking at. In a sense, in our laboratories, that's what we do artificially. We wall off the rest of the world, and we more or less isolate the world to get a subsystem that operates more or less independently. For example, you don't, in an elementary particle experiment, you don't have to worry about gravitational effects of the sun or some distant supernova. You don't have to worry about the electromagnetic effects coming from the airwaves because you've walled those off. You're in a Faraday cage. The thing about the world is that it allows for this kind of subsystem. Now, the normal breakdown of physics, into the various laws of physics might be considered subsystems. For example, you have gravitational variables, you have electromagnetic variables, you have other kinds of variables that are related to the other forces, and they more or less break down. Now, we know that there's not a perfect breakdown because you get to high enough temperatures. There's interactions between the different laws of physics. But at our crystallized state, in a moderate temperature, we have a rough breakdown of physics into these kinds of subsystems. I think we observe these in nature. We observe these in the biological world, where there's millions, literally millions of these kinds of subsystems, but they're not perfect. They look more or less like this. I'm calling this epsilon. This is some small matrix, some small enough matrix, so that when you restrict to the subspace, the small subspace, it's kind of approximately equal to b to the n, but not exactly equal, because this epsilon here, this matrix in the lower left-hand corner, does feed back. In other words, you're having feedback from the larger space into the subsystem. You now, with this more realistic model, do have some sort of feedback, but it's a small feedback. Small enough so that if an organism wants to focus on just these variables here, the subspace, that there is still an advantage conferred by focusing energy on that subspace. Every so often you're going to, the big world's going to come back to bite you. We know that there is a natural culling effect in biology, where we have natural selection. So some of these organisms are going to die because they're not taking into account the larger environment. But enough get through. This is a good enough approximation so that you have a stable niche. You have survival within that stable niche. Now the question is, how do you find this subspace? How do you jerry-rig things so that you'll maybe iteratively move toward that subspace? And that's something that I don't know, but perhaps the Kalman filter context gives us maybe a concrete kind of a problem to think about, where if the overall dynamics, the internal dynamics that's being modeled, the hidden Markov process is being modeled in the Kalman filter, the internal estimates do have this kind of rough breakdown. How do you find it? How do you move toward it? Is there some sort of evolutionary algorithm that would move toward a representation of the overall dynamics? And basically that involves finding that subspace, that K sub. And In other words, can you evolve a Kalman filter? So, the idea is that suppose that there's some Kalman filter that's operative, in your linear dynamical system. You have no idea what it is. But to learn it, you're going to focus on some smaller piece of the puzzle. Not all the variables available to you, but some smaller piece. You home in on that smaller piece, and you somehow adjust the subspace via some kind of a iterative algorithm to try to find a situation where this epsilon is small enough so that the estimates coming from this Kalman filter, this Kalman subfilter, are good enough to be able to navigate, or whatever else you're trying to do with the Kalman filter, to be able to predict the future well enough so that you have some element of survivability. So, and then the question is, what are the systems that allow for this kind of learnability? What are the systems that have this rough breakdown into upper triangular, right? This is called an upper triangular matrix for a pure niche, a perfect niche. What are the systems that allow for this approximate upper triangular breakdown? And is there some kind of classification of those systems? For example, Markov blankets might be systems that allow for that. And are the Markov blankets the most general system that allows for a breakdown like that? Or is there some kind of other classification system? The Markov blankets are just one example. So it's kind of it's a big question. It's a general question. It might be so general that it's intractable. But my own interest in physics was kind of inspired by this, and thinking of this as being the dynamics that focuses on quantum states, this being quantum states, and the largest system being classical states, has given me some leverage in terms of moving forward with my interest. Anyway, that's my rough idea here. It's a very general idea, and again, the generality might be too great to be tractable. We might have to actually have breakdowns, actually hypothesize something about the overall dynamics to begin with. For example, Markov blanket, or some other kind of larger, some large scale dynamical picture, but not just the wide open dynamical picture that I've presented here.
Thank you, John. That's
Okay.
perfect exposition. And now I'd like to, why don't we give a round of applause for John?
Okay, thanks.
That's very
Right.
good. We're
Okay.
happy. And now I'd like to hand it over to Daniel. But I'm thinking that maybe, Daniel, you can say whatever you like, but you can question or interview John further as you find useful. But so please, we look forward to your comments.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both. I will sort of quasi-chronologically go through what I was taking down, hopefully add a few pieces that bounce off from either side. So, Andrius sees the Kalman filter in terms of the three minds. No one is surprised by that. The mind that knows, the mind that questions, and the investigatory thirdness or modulation. And in terms of the Bayesian statistical setting, that maps to the firstness or first mind of the sensory evidence and observations, and then the second mind being the hidden or latent regularities. And a classical setting for this empirically in the statistical parametric mapping software package is neuroimaging, where Y is going to be the neuroimaging data, and X is the time evolution of some dynamical neural system that could be coarse-grained to the voxel, to the neuron, to the region, or to the circuit level. And the Kalman filter, Kalman Filter filter, these methods help get to this value between 0 and 1 that does something like modulating the blend or the balance in that kind of third mind investigatory way of how much to attend to the observation, how deeply to take on that last observation, ranging from the extrema of go with whatever the measurement says because it's that accurate, to the other extreme of this measurement doesn't actually add information to us. And there's that continuum from 0 to 1. Andrius then turned to map that onto active inference and showed some nice connections with Y being the evidence observation, X being the state, and the relationship between Q and P, and several ways that the three minds maps onto the active inference formalism. And one that I thought was very interesting and is a key step is the mapping of P and Q, the classically British minding your P's and Q's, as opposed to crossing your I's and dotting your T's. And Andrius points out that Q can be a simpler model than P, or sometimes, as it would be said, like the organism or the agent's generative model or conceptual model does not need to be the territory. Map doesn't have to be the territory. And it's true that it can be simpler. And the key general piece there is that Q is partitioned or articulated completely separately from P's structure. So there could be an isomorphism or a topology respecting coarse graining between Q and P, like the map that has a topological resemblance or a renormalization relationship to P, the territory. Or Q could be arbitrarily under or overspecified. Like I could just have, I wear a jacket or I don't. And that can arbitrarily simplify temperature through space and time and all of that. And then it can be overspecified. And the hyperparameterization of statistical models, which in one sense is kind of like overkill. It's like, do we really need to bring out the 7 billion parameters to fit something that, you know, we could have phoned home with a linear regression with 1 parameter or 2 parameters? It's like, that's deep learning. And there's a lot of ways which these hyperparameterized models that actually don't initially embody representations semantically of target systems allow us to get to approximative solutions that allow us to interpolate data, deep learning, machine learning, neural networks, all of that. So we can have secondary criticisms about their energy use, their interpretability, the fractured representations that they provide, but over parameterization can actually be really useful. And then Q gives us this whole access to typed computational tools, to diagrams, and then importantly for the variational Bayesian methods, filter and particle and sampling based methods for doing incremental optimization and sampling. So it's like we get this whole statistical toolkit on our map by using this compositional cognitive cartography that we don't necessarily have. And then Andrius closed with the perception action loop with that sort of convex concave duality, not negation in the Blake sense of changing mind and changing the world. And that's like being at a saddle point where there's 2 different gradients. So it could be that there's an equal gradients, and then like from that saddle point, there can be, you can imagine a lot of ways that it can go. Okay. So then John turned to the linear dynamical system and the X vectors, and the ways to get from one state to another state is to multiply with the matrix A. And that can be read in the inbound or perceptual direction as the mapping from observations to latent states, or vice versa. That's the tale of 2 densities. Also, that mapping could be through time, like a Markov transition matrix, the time evolution of a system. So that kind of gives us this chessboard of moves going forward and backwards in time, and also up and down in causal space, or however you want to see that. But it gives this really nice chessboard of ways to move through time and cause. In biology, there's a breakdown to niche, and then the niche concept is maybe up there with the species concept of ways that people say, well, is the niche just simply the abiotic operating environment surrounding something, or is it the Umwelt? Is it the perceived? Is it the enacted relationship where if there's like a non-interacting cosmic ray, is that part of the niche? And then you can imagine, yeah, the person who says, yes, it is everything surrounding organism, whether or not it's interacted with, would say yes. And John here and in his research and in some previous conversations has focused on this relationship between the larger matrix and the submatrix. And so as I wrote it down, there is feedback from the subsystem to the larger system. However, there's no crosstalk downwards. So from the perspective of the living organism, it's like the perfect niche. So I kind of map that to two settings. One of them is like it's an acidity producing fermenting bacteria. So it's like a producing ethanol or it's producing acid, producing kefir, and it is just continually pumping. It's just like pouring water down the drain, and it's like the sink never fills up. It's just flowing. It's going. It's like you're riding a bike downhill, and it just goes at the right speed. It's the perfect um, niche, and that's kind of like the thermodynamic infinite heat bath situation. It's like the engine is running, and it just keeps on off, putting the amount of energy into the environment. It just is an infinite heat bath. So if there were a perfect niche, how would it evolve? And John says he doesn't know. But in terms of the Kalman filter, could there be this evolutionary algorithm that adjusts the matrix and the angle? And then John said, in a laboratory, that's what we do. And I think that's a key feature of lab versus say field science is yes, laboratories wall off the world to get subsystems that operate semi-independently. So like the heat bath that might surround a bomb calorimeter simulates or emulates or virtualizes, encapsulates, etc., an infinite heat bath for the reaction. Like you want the jacket around the reaction to stay at a constant temperature, and it's so relatively large relative to your test tube that changes in the temperature there can be approximated as if the bathtub around it is an infinite heat bath. It's not, but it gets close enough. And then in the behavioral setting, it's of course more complex, but similarly, there can be replicated or stationary, whether it's unchanging or limit attractors or other chosen regimes, but stimuli can be chosen from a stationary set. Whereas if we allowed the laboratory animal to engage in this open-ended bidirectional coevolution, there in principle would be an open-endedness, and then in practice there would be historiosity. So there would be no replicates within or across time series, because the time series of one behaving animal would have this sort of co-adaptation where the laboratory in the second half was not the laboratory in the first half, so you can't really get replication through time. And then different replicates of across different halls in your laboratory department, they wouldn't be true replicates either, because they would have different historical unfoldings. And so John closed with this question: could the Kalman filter context help us? So I think that is an exciting thing to discuss. And here's where it kind of took me in my wondering is, where is action in this? So let's imagine that there's a radio enthusiast who's purely receiving, and they're using a Kalman filter to refine the best sound they can, which is like exactly how software-defined radio, all this stuff works. That's the signal processing setting that, in parallel with control theory, developed over the 1900s and brings us to this fusion today. And so what actions could that radio receiver engage in? So one type of action would be changing the frequency dial on the radio. And deeper manipulations could be done, like changing electrical aspects or changing the topology of the radio circuit board. So we have the radio dial, which is kind of like fine-tuning or online inference, which is like changing the knobs that you have in your model as structurally parametrically defined. That's like fine-tuning or online inference. Then there's changing the radio anatomy through action, which is like structure learning or weight updating, making topological changes to the neural network, which is kind of a first mind move, or making topological changes to the symbolic network, which is more of the second mind move. So those are all things that the radio operator can do, modifying their radio largely as it is on through whole rip and replace type operations on their apparatus. And then that takes us right to the verge of the ultimate and interesting type of action, which is the interaction through sending back on the radio. Hey, could you send only on even hours UTC? Or could you use this frequency? And that takes us back to the laboratory and the open-endedness. And so it's a lot of interesting topics, and the way that the Kalman filter starts us in a position of signal processing and sense making but through unifying frameworks of perception and action can take us to this whole panoply of topics beyond.
Let's give a round of
Yeah.
applause
Right.
to Daniel for,
Yeah. Sounds like you were listening, Daniel.
yeah, very articulate. So what I'll do is, and we have Steph here with us, and so if you can think of a brilliant 2-minute things, I'll give you a chance to think about it, but like you can add. But what I'd like to do now, John, is what's your response to Daniel? Like, how would you engage his thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Daniel, you expressed a lot more detail than I would be I'd be able to conjure up, in terms of this. But it sounds like these kinds of questions you know, are kind of related to your interests. I guess maybe the overriding question, that I'm interested in is what are learnable systems? Like how is there some kind of a mathematical hierarchy or breakdown of learnable systems that, um, is there some kind of a theoretical decomposition of or understanding of what systems are learnable and what systems are not? It's perhaps a big question, um, but maybe it is a tractable question. Maybe it's something that over time could, classification theory could be constructed. But whatever that theory is would also help explain why the universe is learnable. Like, why are we in a, like if we were in a 20 million degree plasma, I don't believe that's learnable. Like, I don't think that, even though the laws of physics are there that could be broken down, we wouldn't be able to observe anything that would reveal any insight into the law of physics, because there's too much crosstalk, there's too much interaction, there's too much noise. And so, certainly the way that cosmologists think about it is they think of, that the universe kind of crystallized in a way, and then as temperature decreased, different structures arose and allowed for kind of a parsing of the universe, But the thing is, what is it about the universe that allowed that in the first place? Why isn't everything connected to everything and interacting in both directions with everything? In quantum mechanics, there's non-locality, and you would think that every wave function is interacting with every other wave function. I mean, what the hell? Why is there this breakdown? Andrius Andrius has thought a lot about the big picture, and you may have thoughts about, why it has to be that way. And in a microcosm of that is why is our biological states on Earth have this rough breakdown also. Why can you isolate, a single electron in a laboratory? It's rather remarkable. So there's something remarkable about our universe that begs for explanation here. That is the end of my comment.
Andrius, you're on mute.
Thank you,
Okay.
John and Steph. I want to ask Steph Macurdy, and thank you for joining us, Steph. And Steph researches blockchain, cryptocurrency, and active inference, how that relates. Please, Steph, what are your thoughts?
Oh boy. I'm new to active inference. I am in accumulation of wisdom from people who I'm beginning to trust in active inference. And I definitely have an intuition about my own model. And so active inference feels very intuitive in applying it in different scenarios. My intuition came from soccer. It was a limited game space, but there's enough possibility there to model myself, model others, and model feedback between the two. And so I feel very comfortable thinking in active inference terms. It just never really put it into math.
In this talk, did anything strike you? Or
This last part John mentioned about cosmological evolution,
okay.
I do have that perspective, and I do believe that the universe is crystallized into gradients, and then there is just go ahead.
Yeah. So then I want to share. Thank you, Steph. And I want to share the ideas I got, and then I'll let Daniel and John give concluding remarks. Just want to say a quick hi to Marcus. He's been coming in and out. Marcus, do you have any thoughts on this talk? What you heard of it? Anything to add?
Yeah, I was dodging in and out because I was in a dojo and then I was out the dojo. So just to explain why I wasn't here. John's talk, I was thinking, when you had the niche, there's something kind of missing there. There's the niche construction and how the niche appeared over time. And I think that relates to the cosmos as well. So if we think of a singularity that the universe expanded from, was everything in connection with everything at that point? So at what point does it lose that connection? Is that just our perception that it's lost the connection, or is the connection still there? But that's just a quick point.
Yeah. Comment, John?
Well, no, I think it's a good point there. I don't know how these niches, I don't know a general algorithm by which these niches evolve. You know, I imagine, I'm just imagining it's some kind of evolutionary algorithm.
So why don't I add my thoughts? Putting together what you said, I think inspired by Daniel's talking about active inference. Like Daniel had a great question, where's the action? You know, like we can start to look at these things. So if you look at your big matrix A and then the little submatrix B, those are the two minds, I think. You know, that's the P and the Q, right? Like that's the sensory evidence and then the modeling. So the third mind, or the Kalman filter, the Kalman gain, let's say, it should be a matrix sitting within B. Imagine if there was a matrix C sitting in B, right? Because just like the question is the answer as, you know, an answer, like it's kind of divorced from, you know, when the map is part of the territory because it's a piece of paper, right? Like so you have this weird thing where, you know, the answer of the answer, that's what a question is, right? And then if you took another answer, like you'd be that much more removed, right? Like there in that map, there's another little map, you know. So but the point is that, so first imagine taking A, you've gotten broken down B, now within that breakdown C, right? And somehow that C's got to be doing the controlling. The action is in the real world. The action should be in the A, but the action should be coming from B. So the action should be somewhere in that upper right-hand corner, right? And little by little, you can start to piece these things together. And you can kind of see, of course, like Daniel, I think, nudging us, and you were saying with the epsilon, there's got to be, you know, some kind of feedback in there, or maybe not, but then there's got to be some kind of way. How does the big picture affect the little picture? Another important point to say is that lovely example by Daniel about those bacteria that just, you know, are doing their own thing, and then the world just, you know, receives them. Deep inside each of us, I think, and this is relevant for economics, like in Steph's concern, like deep inside each of us, there's a independent thinker, an independent being, or maybe just the living Jesus or whatever, who simply is not going to be crushed by the world. It's absolutely like there's nothing the world can do to kind of like impact that deep thing. We can lose touch with it, but deep inside there's this thing there that shows us, that's saying it's absolutely upper triangular. There's no thing that can actually affect it. And it can somehow be a driving force backwards. Now, how does it do that? Not clear. I think those are my key remarks. Concluding remarks by John and Daniel.
Oh, so, you know, these ideas I've had, again, for a long time. It's taken me into physics, and there I seem to have not recovered. You know, I thought that I would come back to this idea of a Kalman filter and maybe an evolutionary algorithm years ago, because I think it's much more practical than what I'm thinking about in physics. And I like practical problems, but I just have not had time. You know, I have this limited commodity, and it you know, it seems that I always get sucked back into thinking about physics. So I'm just kind of throwing these ideas out there to see if there's some interest. I wouldn't mind working with someone on this kind of stuff, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do it alone. I think I just am too time limited. And so, yeah, if this talk stimulates some interest and you want to have a continuing conversation, I'm game. But I probably am not going to be the driving force of this idea, you know.
Thank you, John, for presenting.
Yeah.
Daniel, your closing thoughts, and then I'll ask Marcus for a concluding prayer. Please, Daniel.
Thank you, John. Yeah, it's great research, as with what differentiates scientific research in many cases from a personal art inquiry. It is awesome to have it be collaborative. So I also look forward to the future of people picking up pieces and human and other intelligences interpolating and extending as they see fit. And where the closing piece took me is William Blake's Innocence and Experience. And innocence being the openness to observation, and experience being the residue and the inertia of the prior, and the eternal summer within the winter, and vice versa, and that happening on the 0 to 1 interval that we know is infinite.
That's a
Nice.
prayer, and in itself, I think. But
I
and then
believe so. I don't think I
Okay.
can top infinity.
Peace and love, everybody. Thank you for watching this video. Please go to mathforwisdom.com or simply read the description to this video to learn how you can join our Math for Wisdom discussion group and our study groups. Thank you for liking this video, for subscribing to this YouTube channel, and for supporting Math for Wisdom through Patreon.
I am John Harland. I lead the physics study group for Math for Wisdom. And I'm a Patreon supporter of Math for Wisdom because the conversations I have with Andrius and other people who engage with Math for Wisdom have been very, very useful for me. And so in becoming a Patreon supporter, I hope to continue these conversations and to be able to create a base of support for Andrius and possibly some of the other contributors of Math for Wisdom, so that these conversations can continue going forward, because it's a way of engaging with people with different points of view and kind of getting outside your own echo chamber. So again, these conversations have been very useful for me, and that's why I'm a Patreon supporter of Math for Wisdom.